It all started with a dream, a simple American dream, saturated with the smell of treated lumber and the promise of perfectly charred hot dogs. For 3 consecutive weekends, I, Leo Maxwell, a man whose primary physical exertion usually involved swapping out a server rack, had become a god of construction. My kingdom was a modest 10 by 12-foot rectangle of wood in my backyard. My subjects were a platoon of deck screws and a pile of 2x6s I'd wrestled out of my minivan. My sacred texts were a series of conflicting YouTube tutorials. I stood there now, on the nearly finished platform, a cold beer sweating in my hand, admiring my handiwork. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. The air was cool. This, I thought to myself, was it. This was the pinnacle of suburban achievement. Not a corner office, not a fancy car, but a flat, stable surface upon which a grill could be placed. "It's beautiful," my partner Sarah said from the sliding glass door. She stepped out onto the deck, testing its sturdiness with a tentative bounce. "It doesn't wobble. I'm genuinely shocked." "Have you so little faith?" I asked, puffing out my chest. "This is the work of a master craftsman, a man who measured twice, cut once, and only swore loudly enough to frighten the squirrels a handful of times." "So what color stain are we thinking?" she asked, tracing a wood grain pattern with her toe. "Something natural? A nice cedar tone?" "I was thinking something bold," I mused, taking a long sip of beer. "Something that says, 'I am a man who owns a deck, and I am not afraid of a little mildew, maybe triumphant oak or victorious walnut.'" We laughed. It was perfect. This deck wasn't just wood and screws. It was an investment in our future happiness. It was a declaration that we were here to stay, to host mediocre barbecues, to sit in cheap lawn chairs and complain about mosquitoes. It was our fortress of tranquility. For 3 weekends, I had sacrificed my sanity, my thumbnails, and my sacroiliac to the gods of Home Depot. And now, my majestic rectangle of wood, my personal platform of peace, was done. My wooden kingdom, a place for grilling, for chilling, for contemplating why I pay so much in property taxes. That last thought, it turned out, was a bit of cosmic foreshadowing. Because just as I was imagining the triumphant hiss of a burger patty hitting the grill, a different, more ominous sound reached my ears. The clinical, joyless crunch of tires on the gravel of my driveway. A crisp, white sedan, the kind that only exists to deliver bad news or pizza, pulled to a stop. It had the city's official seal on the door, a confusing jumble of a gear, a leaf, and a very stoic-looking eagle. Out of the driver's side stepped a man. He was dressed in a pale blue polo shirt, tucked a little too tightly into khaki pants. He held a clipboard against his chest like a ballistic shield. And on his upper lip sat a mustache so perfectly trimmed, so utterly devoid of personality, it could only have been grown for the sole purpose of looking disappointed in other people. He walked toward my backyard with the unearned confidence of a man who has never been told he's wrong, his gaze fixed on my beautiful, beautiful deck. "Afternoon," he said, his voice as flat as the Nebraska plains. He stopped at the edge of the lawn, refusing to set foot on my property just yet, as if it might be contagious. "City Code Enforcement? You the owner, Leo Maxwell?" I took a defensive swig of beer. "That depends. Are you selling something or delivering a giant check?" The mustache didn't even twitch. "I'm here about the unpermitted structure." My brain took a moment to process the phrase. The what now? You mean my deck? I gestured at it with my beer bottle. It's not a structure. It's a collection of wood I nailed together. It's a suggestion of a floor, an outdoor flooring experiment. All outdoor platforms exceeding 30 inches in height, or 20 square feet in area, require a construction permit from the City Planning Department as per Ordinance 113.8, subsection C, he recited, his eyes as vacant as a dial tone. This was Carl Thompson, though I didn't know his name yet. All I knew was that he was the human embodiment of a rubber stamp, the physical manifestation of a form you have to fill out in triplicate. He finally stepped into the yard and pulled a small laser measuring device from his belt. He zapped a beam to the edge of the deck. He hummed, a low, judgmental sound. He walked to the side, zapped it again. And the setbacks? The what backs? I asked, my sarcasm glands kicking into high gear. Your structure appears to be within the 5-foot property line setback. That's violation number 1. He made a neat little check mark on his clipboard. He then knelt, his khakis groaning in protest, and peered under the deck. Support posts. Are these sunk below the frost line? 42 inches for this region. They're sunk pretty deep, I said vaguely. I hit a big rock on one of them. The shovel and I had a long talk about it. Unacceptable, he declared, standing up and brushing dust from his knees that wasn't there. He walked onto my deck, my sacred space, and pulled out a tape measure, checking the spacing of the balusters on the one railing I'd managed to finish. Baluster spacing is 4¼ inches. Maximum allowable spacing is 4 inches to prevent a child's head from passing through. We don't have a child, I said. We have a moody cat, and his head is significantly larger than 4 inches. I've seen him try to get into a shoebox. He's safe. Carl was unmoved by my logic. He just kept making notes, his pen scratching with a terrible finality. And of course, he said, turning to face me with an air of profound gravity. The primary violation. You never filed for, nor were you issued, a permit for the construction. He looked me dead in the eye. You just built it. He said the words built it like I had confessed to launching a pig into orbit. Yeah? I said, confused. That's usually how things get built. Someone builds them. He ignored me, his duty done. With a flourish, he ripped a sheet from his clipboard. A carbon copy, yellow and flimsy. The verdict. He handed it to me. I stared down at the sheet, a laundry list of my supposed crimes against the city charter. Unlawful construction, setback encroachment, improper safety railings. The list went on. And then I saw the number at the bottom, circled in red ink. My blood ran cold. $2,500? I whispered. It came out as a squeak. You're fining me $2,500? That's the initial penalty, he said, his voice betraying a hint of something that might have been satisfaction. In addition, a daily penalty of $100 will be assessed until the structure is either brought into compliance or removed entirely. I stared at him, then at the ticket, then at my glorious wooden rectangle. Brought into compliance? Based on his laundry list, that would mean tearing the whole thing down and starting over. This wasn't about safety. A 1/4-inch gap in a railing wasn't going to endanger anyone. This was about power. This was about a man with a laser measurer and a rule book getting to ruin someone's day. And this guy, this walking, talking embodiment of a pop-up ad, had all of it. He gave a curt nod, turned, and walked back to his car, his mission of spreading misery complete. I was left standing on my illegal deck, the yellow fine crumpled in my fist, the triumphant beer now tasting like ash in my mouth. My eyes drifted past the edge of my lawn to the small, pathetic creek that trickled along the back of my property line. It wasn't much, just a muddy stream that eventually fed into the local river a few miles away. The city owned my land. They could tell me what to build, how to build it, and where. But as I stared at the murky water, a single, defiant thought echoed in the silent, furious chamber of my mind. They want to regulate my land? Fine, but what about the water? My first instinct wasn't rebellion. It was reason. I'm an IT manager, for God's sake. My entire life revolves around the principle that if you follow a logical process, you get a predictable outcome. If a server is down, you check the power, then the network cable, then the software. You follow the steps. I figured dealing with the city would be the same. I was wrong. I was so very wrong. My journey into the bureaucratic black hole began the next morning with a visit to the City Planning Department's website. It was a digital relic, a masterpiece of 1998 web design with blinking text, a confusing number of fonts, and a color scheme that could only be described as nauseous beige. After 20 minutes of clicking on broken links, I finally found the Permit Appeals section. It was a single PDF form that I had to print, fill out by hand, scan, and then email to an address that was probably routed to a computer sitting unplugged in a dusty closet. I dutifully filled it out in my neatest block lettering, outlining my case with what I thought was irrefutable logic. The deck is a minor, non-commercial improvement, poses no danger to public safety. The cited violations are trivial and can be easily remedied. I sounded like a reasonable adult. This was my first mistake. My second mistake was calling the phone number listed on the bottom of the form. "City of Wellspring, how may I direct your call?" A bored voice answered. "Yes, I'd like to speak to someone in the planning department about a citation appeal," I said, full of hope. Click, I was on hold. The music that filled my ear wasn't just bad. It was an affront to the very concept of music. It was a smooth jazz saxophone solo that sounded like a goose being slowly squeezed to death. I later learned this specific track was called Kenny G's Lament, and I swear it was designed as a form of auditory torture to make people hang up. I held on for 27 minutes before a new voice picked up. Planning. "Yes, hello," I said, overly cheerful. "I'm calling about citation number 7G4B. That's a code enforcement issue. You need to talk to them. Let me transfer you." Click. The dying goose returned, this time accompanied by a lethargic bass line. I was on hold for another 18 minutes. "Enforcement, Thompson speaking." It was him. It was Carl. "Carl, it's Leo Maxwell. You know, the guy with the unpermitted structure?" "I am aware," he said, his voice colder than a server room. "Look, I've filed an appeal, and I just wanted to see if we could talk this out. Man to man. I can fix the railings. I can—" "The appeals process is handled by the Municipal Hearings Board," he cut me off. "Your appeal will be reviewed in due course. You will be notified of your hearing date by mail." Click. He hung up. I was trapped in a Kafka novel, but with more paperwork and worse music. For the next 2 weeks, I was passed around the city government like a hot potato, except I wasn't a potato. I was a man slowly losing his will to live. I talked to someone in zoning who sent me to public works, who sent me back to planning. Each person I spoke to was an expert in one tiny, insignificant part of the process, and completely ignorant of everything else. It was like trying to assemble a car by only talking to the guy who installs the hubcaps. Finally, a letter arrived. My hearing was scheduled. I put on a tie. I printed out photos of my deck. I even prepared a short, compelling speech. I was ready. The hearing was held in a windowless room in the basement of City Hall that smelled faintly of despair and old coffee. I sat on a hard wooden bench, waiting for my turn. The appeals board consisted of 3 people who looked like they had been sentenced to be there. One was asleep, or possibly dead. One was doodling on a legal pad. The third, the chairman, just stared at the clock on the wall, willing it to move faster. When they called my name, I walked to the podium and presented my case. I was calm. I was logical. I showed them the pictures. I explained my willingness to make the necessary changes. I thought I did a pretty good job. Then it was Carl's turn. He strode to the podium carrying a 3-ring binder that must have weighed 15 pounds. He opened it and began to speak in a monotonous drone, citing codes and ordinances with the passionless authority of a speak and spell. He made my charming little deck sound like a public menace, a shoddily constructed death trap that threatened the very foundations of civilized society. He presented his own evidence, grainy, overexposed photos taken from an angle that made the deck look like it was leaning at a 45-degree angle. I had charts. I had a compelling narrative. I even wore a tie. Carl had a 3-ring binder and the charisma of a mollusk. Guess who won? After reviewing the evidence, the chairman droned, barely looking up from the clock. The board finds in favor of the city. The citation and all associated fines are upheld. Next case. And that was it. My logical, reasonable process had collided with an immovable wall of apathy. I walked out of that basement room, the knot of my tie suddenly feeling like a noose. Defeated, I drove home and went to the backyard. I sat on a lawn chair and just stared at the offending deck. Sarah came out and put a hand on my shoulder. "We can just tear it down, Leo," she said softly. "It's not worth this headache." "No," I said, my voice quiet. It wasn't about the deck anymore. It was the principle. They had beaten me with their rulebook, and I couldn't stand it. Out of pure spite, I pulled out my phone and started reading the city's online municipal code myself. It was 1,000 pages of dense, unreadable legalese. But I was determined. I scrolled through zoning laws, property regulations, building requirements, and then, deep in a section about waterfront properties, I found it. It was a specific, oddly worded subsection about docks and piers. I read it once, then twice. My heart started to beat a little faster. It said, temporary, non-permanent floating structures, including but not limited to watercraft and mooring platforms, are not subject to the same property setback and permitting requirements as permanent terrestrial structures. A light bulb didn't just go on in my head. A supernova exploded. Terrestrial structures. That meant structures on land. My deck was a terrestrial structure. But the creek at the back of my yard, that was technically a waterway. It was on the county maps. And if something was floating on that waterway, was it a structure? Or was it a boat? You can't get a permit violation for parking a boat at a dock. The city doesn't regulate boats. The State Department of Fish and Wildlife does. And what is a deck, really, but a horizontal surface for relaxing and grilling? And what is a pontoon boat, but a prefabricated, mobile, floating deck with its own engine and registration number? I slowly looked up from my phone, a wild, manic grin spreading across my face. Sarah saw my expression and took a small step back. "Oh no," she said. "I know that look. That's the I'm about to do something incredibly stupid but technically correct look." "Honey," I said, my voice trembling with the sheer genius of it, "I have a terrible, wonderful, possibly illegal idea. We're going to buy a boat." Embarking on a quest to buy a used pontoon boat when you know nothing about boats is a unique form of self-punishment. My life for the next week became a blur of sun-faded vinyl, questionable engine histories, and the particular scent of mildewed carpeting that seems to be a prerequisite for any watercraft over a decade old. I dove headfirst into the digital swamp of Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist, places where grammar goes to die, and every seller is your buddy until money changes hands. My search history became a cry for help. Cheap pontoon, ugly boat not sinking. Does a pontoon boat need a title if used as patio? I wasn't looking for a vessel to take out on the lake for a day of fun and sun. I was looking for a loophole. I needed something that was legally a boat, but functionally a deck. It didn't need to be fast. It didn't need to be pretty. It just needed to float, and ideally not give me tetanus. The messages I exchanged with sellers were a masterclass in minimalist communication. I messaged a guy named Salty Dave about his 1994 Sun Chaser. Me: "Hi, is the Sun Chaser still available? Does the engine run?" Salty Dave: "Yep, runs." Me: "Great, any issues I should know about?" Salty Dave: "Floor is soft in a spot. Seats got some sun." Some sun turned out to be marketplace speak for the vinyl has been baked into a fine, crumbly powder that will permanently fuse with your pants. Then there was Catfish Ron and his pride and joy, the party barge. His ad featured exactly one blurry photo taken at night, where the boat was mostly obscured by a large dog. Me: "Hi, is the party barge still available?" Catfish Ron: "She is. Runs like a dream if the dream is a nightmare with a persistent cough. Upholstery is 50% vinyl, 50% duct tape. Best offer takes her, buddy." I appreciated his honesty, but I had to pass. I was losing hope, starting to believe my brilliant plan would be scuttled by a lack of suitable, cheap, floating platforms. But then I saw it. The ad was simple. Old pontoon boat, $10,200. The pictures showed a vessel that had clearly lived a long and full life. The once blue railings were faded to the color of a summer sky. The pontoons were dented. The name painted on the side was peeling, but I could just make it out. The Soggy Bottom. It was perfect. I drove an hour out into the countryside to a house with a huge, rambling yard filled with old engines and rusting projects. The owner, a grizzled old man named Hank, with hands like baseball mitts and a twinkle in his eye, came out to meet me. "You're here for the boat?" he asked, wiping grease from his hands onto an already black rag. "I am," I said, trying to sound like I knew what I was doing. "Mind if I take a look?" "Knock yourself out." I walked around the Soggy Bottom. I kicked one of the aluminum pontoons. It made a dull thunk. Good, solid thunk. I nodded knowingly. I climbed aboard and stomped on the plywood floor. It felt solid enough. The furniture was a collection of cracked vinyl benches and a couple of plastic fishing chairs that had been bolted to the floor. "Engine starts most of the time," Hank offered. "Steering's a little loose, but she floats. That much I can guarantee." "That's really all I need," I admitted. And then, because Hank seemed like a decent guy, I decided to tell him the truth. I told him about the deck, about Carl and his clipboard, about the fines, and about the loophole in the city code. I laid out my entire, insane plan to moor a pontoon boat to my back door and call it a patio. Hank listened intently, a slow grin spreading across his face. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he let out a huge, booming laugh, slapping his knee. "Son, that is the best damn thing I've ever heard," he roared. "You ain't even gonna put it in the lake? You're just gonna tie it up in that little ditch behind your house?" "It's not a ditch," I corrected him, a little defensively. "It's a navigable waterway. And it's not a boat, it's a floating patio." This sent him into another fit of laughter. "A floating patio? Oh, that's rich." He wiped a tear from his eye. "Tell you what, you're doing the Lord's work, sticking it to the city like that. I like your style. $1,000 and she's all yours. I'll even deliver it for you." I shook his hand. A deal struck. I was now the proud owner of a boat. Step 1 was complete. Step 2 was trickier. I needed a bridge from my house to my new patio boat. I couldn't build steps, because that would be a structure. No, I needed a gangplank. Finding a contractor willing to entertain this idea was an adventure in itself. The first 2 I called hung up on me after I finished explaining what I wanted. I think they thought it was a prank call. The third one just said, I don't think my insurance covers that," and wished me luck. Finally, I found a small, independent company online called M&D Custom Decks and Ramps. Their website looked like it was made by a nephew who had just discovered word art, but their gallery showed solid work. I called, and a gruff voice answered. "Mike?" I launched into my pitch, expecting the click of a hang-up. But when I finished, there was only silence. "So," Mike said after a long pause, "let me get this straight. You got an illegal deck, and instead of tearing it down, you bought a boat. And now you want us to build a ramp from your house over the illegal deck to the boat, which is in a creek." "Essentially, yes," I said. "But it's not a ramp. It's a removable gangplank. And it's not a boat. It's a recreational floating platform." I heard him shout away from the phone. "Hey, Dave, you gotta hear this." I heard some muffled conversation, and then a new voice on the line. "This is Dave. Is this for real?" 100%, I confirmed. Another pause. Then a low chuckle. "Okay, we'll come to take a look. This I gotta see." Mike and Dave showed up the next day. They were 2 big, burly guys, covered in tattoos and sawdust, who looked like they could build a house with a hammer and sheer willpower. They stood in my backyard, arms crossed, staring at the space where the boat would eventually go. I explained the whole saga with Carl and the city. Mike stroked his thick beard, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You want a wheelchair ramp for a boat in your yard?" "It's a gangplank," I insisted. Dave walked to the edge of the creek, peered into it, and then looked back at me. A slow, wide grin spread across his face. "I like it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's stupid, but I like it." He turned to his partner. "This is one of those screw-the-man jobs, Mike." Mike nodded. The decision made. Screw-the-man jobs always pay extra. "I'm willing to pay a premium for absurdity," I said. They spent the next hour taking measurements, sketching out a design on a scrap of plywood. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. A sturdy wooden ramp, about 12 feet long, with railings. The end at my sliding glass door would rest on the deck, but not be attached. The end over the water would have 2 heavy-duty wheels, so it could be rolled back and forth. It was, by any legal definition, temporary and removable. It was perfect. They understood the vision. They weren't just contractors. They were co-conspirators. My rebellion was starting to get allies. Launch day was a spectacle of organized chaos. When the flatbed truck carrying the soggy bottom rumbled down my quiet suburban street, curtains twitched in every window. Hank was behind the wheel, grinning like a proud father. Getting the boat from the street to the creek in my backyard, however, was a slapstick ballet of incompetence. Our master plan involved a heavy-duty winch Hank had brought, a lot of rope, and what turned out to be some wildly optimistic physics. The first attempt saw the boat slide off the flatbed and immediately get stuck in the soft part of my lawn, listing like a beached whale. The whole neighborhood was watching by now. My neighbor from 2 doors down, Mr. Henderson, a retired engineer, came over with a six-pack and a lawn chair to supervise. "You need to change your angle of attack, son," he'd yell between sips. "Use the oak tree as your primary anchor point. You're losing all your torque." After an hour of pushing, pulling, and a great deal of sweating, we, along with 2 other neighbors who had been drawn in by the sheer spectacle of it all, finally managed to coax the aluminum beast down the slight grassy incline and into the creek. It landed with a surprisingly gentle splash. And then, miraculously, it floated. It actually floated. A cheer went up from our small, muddy crew. Next came Mike and Dave with the gangplank. They rolled it into place with practiced efficiency, its wheels resting gently on the edge of the boat's deck. The other end sat perfectly on my illegal deck, right in front of the sliding glass door. It was done. I stood back, covered in mud and sweat, and admired my creation. A 20-year-old pontoon boat was tethered to 2 trees in my backyard, connected to my house by a wooden ramp. It was the stupidest, most beautiful thing I had ever seen. My house now had a boat for a patio. It was absurd. It was magnificent. It was a giant aluminum middle finger pointed directly at City Hall. To celebrate, Sarah and I invited our friends over for the inaugural barbecue that weekend. Their reactions were worth the price of admission. Our friend Mark just stood in the doorway, his mouth hanging open for a full minute before he managed to speak. "Leo, you are a madman," he finally said, shaking his head in disbelief. "A suburban pirate." "I prefer maritime innovator," I replied, handing him a beer. We christened the boat by having Sarah break a bottle of cheap champagne over the railing. It took her 3 tries, but it finally shattered, anointing the soggy bottom as our official recreational space. We set up lawn chairs, a small table, and my trusty Weber grill on the boat's deck. It worked. It was a genuinely functional, if slightly wobbly, patio. The gentle rocking motion was actually kind of pleasant. "Welcome, everyone, to the patio at sea," I announced grandly. "Please mind the gangplank. And for God's sake, don't all stand on one side at once. We haven't tested the load balancing yet." Sarah just rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. "I just want everyone to know I am a hostage in this situation," she announced to our guests. "A willing hostage, but a hostage nonetheless." The party was a hit. The novelty of grilling burgers on a boat in a backyard was not lost on anyone. We were, yes, laughing, drinking, and having a great time. It was everything I had dreamed my original deck would be, only now it was weirder, and therefore better. The blissful scene, however, was destined to be interrupted. I saw her marching across her perfectly manicured lawn, her face a thundercloud of neighborhood disapproval. It was Carol, my next-door neighbor. Carol was the self-appointed guardian of suburban conformity, a woman who once left a passive-aggressive note on our door because one of our recycling bins was a slightly different shade of blue than the approved ones. She stopped at the property line, her hands on her hips, and stared at the scene. Her gaze went from the boat to the grill to the gangplank, and finally to me. "Leo," she said, her voice tight with restrained outrage. "What is that?" I gave her my most charming smile, holding up a spatula. "That, Carol, is my new floating patio. It's a boat, fully registered with the State Department of Fish and Wildlife." I pointed with the spatula to the brand-new registration numbers I had painstakingly applied to the side of the pontoon. "See? Got the little stickers right there. All legal and everything." "A boat doesn't belong in a backyard," she snapped. "It's an eyesore. It's going to attract seabirds." "Well, according to Carl Thompson from the city, a deck doesn't belong in my backyard either. So here we are," I said cheerfully. "Compromise. Besides, it's not in the yard, it's in the creek. Big difference, jurisdictionally speaking." Carol's face was turning a fascinating shade of plum. She sputtered for a moment, unable to form a coherent sentence. This is against the rules." "Whose rules, Carol?" I asked, flipping a burger. "There are no rules in the non-existent HOA you keep trying to start. Believe me, I've checked." She gave me a look that could curdle milk, then spun on her heel and stormed back to her house. "I'm calling the city," she yelled over her shoulder. I just smiled. "Tell Carl I said hi," I called after her. I took a bite of my burger and enjoyed the gentle, rhythmic rocking of my loophole. The storm was coming, I knew. But for now, the water was calm. A week passed, a glorious, peaceful week. I spent every evening on my floating patio, enjoying the gentle breeze and the confused looks from passers-by on the street behind my house. I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, Carol's threat was an empty one. Perhaps the city had decided I wasn't worth the trouble. It was a pleasant fantasy. And like most fantasies, it was brutally shattered by the sight of that crisp, white city sedan pulling up to my curb. Carl Thompson emerged, clipboard in hand. He had an air of smug victory about him, the look of a man who had come to witness a sinner's repentance. He probably expected to find my backyard empty, the illegal deck dismantled, my spirit broken. He marched around the side of the house, ready to deliver his final judgment. And then he saw it. He stopped dead in his tracks. His mouth fell open slightly. His brain, an organ finely tuned to process violations of terrestrial building codes, could not compute the scene before him. The deck was still there, now serving as a landing platform. And beyond it, bobbing gently in the muddy creek, was the soggy bottom, my glorious 20-foot-long aluminum loophole. His mustache twitched. I had seen that expression once before on a laptop right after I'd spilled coffee on it. A complete and total system failure. I was, of course, prepared for this moment. I was sitting in a lawn chair on the boat's deck, sipping a tall glass of iced tea, a book open on my lap. I looked up and gave him a friendly wave. "Afternoon, Carl," I called out cheerfully. "Lovely day for it. Welcome to my floating patio. Can I offer you a drink? It's a bit of a walk, I'm afraid." He finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled squawk. "What? In the name of... what is this?" "This is my new recreational area," I explained patiently, as if to a small child. "Had to get rid of the old one, you see. Permit issues." "You were ordered to remove the unpermitted structure," he sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at the original deck. Not attach it to a derelict watercraft?" "Oh, that?" I said, gesturing vaguely at the wooden platform. "That's not a deck anymore. It's just a gangplank landing. It's an accessory to the primary recreational vehicle. The main event, as you can see, is this vessel." I patted the railing of the boat affectionately. "This is the Soggy Bottom. She's a registered boat, floating on a state-recognized waterway. That puts her under the jurisdiction of the Department of Fish and Wildlife, not the City Planning Department. Completely different set of regulations." I took a slow sip of my iced tea. "I'm sure a man of your expertise can appreciate the nuance." I had broken him. I had presented him with a problem that couldn't be solved by simply quoting paragraph 4, subsection B of the city charter. His procedural mind was grinding its gears, stripping them bare. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked from the boat to his clipboard, as if hoping to find a form for illegal backyard navy. Finding none, he spun around and marched back to his car, muttering under his breath. This, I knew, was merely round 1. Round 2 arrived 30 minutes later in the form of a police cruiser. Carl, it seemed, had called for backup. A younger officer and an older, world-weary sergeant got out of the car and followed Carl into my backyard. The younger cop took one look at the boat, the gangplank, and me sitting there reading a novel, and I saw his shoulders start to shake as he tried to suppress a laugh. The sergeant just sighed, the deep, profound sigh of a man who has seen far too much human strangeness in his career. "Afternoon, sir," the sergeant said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We got a call about, he paused, glancing at his notepad. "An illegal mooring?" "Afternoon, officers," I said politely, setting my book down. "Is there a problem? As you can see, the vessel is securely moored to private property. I used a bowline knot and everything. Read up on it. It's not obstructing any traffic." I paused for effect. "Unless you count the occasional duck." I heard the younger officer snort behind his partner. "He's calling the ducks traffic," he whispered. "Carl here," the sergeant continued, gesturing with his thumb at the fuming code enforcement officer. "Says this is a zoning violation." "With all due respect, Sergeant, this is a maritime issue now," I countered, leaning forward earnestly. "It's a boat, in water. It's not zoned property, it's a waterway. If there's a legal issue, you might need to call the Coast Guard. And for your peace of mind," I added, pointing to a large, unopened package on one of the benches, "you can see that everyone on board has a life vest readily available. Safety first." The sergeant stared at me. He stared at the boat. He looked back at Carl, whose face was now the color of a ripe tomato. The cops were completely baffled. This was a civil matter, a zoning dispute of such epic absurdity that it fell far outside their purview. They couldn't arrest me for creative compliance. "Sir," the sergeant said to Carl, "this isn't a criminal matter. We can't do anything here. This is your problem to sort out with the city attorney." He tipped his hat to me. "Have a nice day, sir. Try not to fall in." The two officers turned and left, the younger one now openly chuckling. It was a massive moral victory. I had successfully repelled the first wave of bureaucratic assault. Carl stood there for another minute, his jaw working silently, then stormed off without another word. The following week, the letters started arriving. They were no longer from code enforcement, but from the city attorney's office, each one on heavy, important-looking letterhead. They were getting creative. The first was a notice to cease and desist regarding an unauthorized dock and permanent watercraft installation. I wrote back, explaining that the gangplank was removable and the boat was a registered vehicle, not a permanent installation. I included a photocopy of the boat's registration. The next letter was a fine for environmental contamination, citing potential for fuel or oil leakage into the creek. I wrote back again, informing them that I had siphoned all the gas out of the tank and the engine hadn't been started in months. The third one was my favorite. It was a violation notice for an improper fence. Their argument was that since the boat was blocking access to the back of my property, its railings now constituted my rear fence, and they were not of an approved height or material. They were just making things up now. It was like playing chess with a pigeon. It knocks over all the pieces, poops on the board, and then struts around like it won. I took each new violation notice, framed it, and hung it on the wall in my hallway. It was becoming a gallery of pettiness, a monument to their impotent rage. And with each new letter, my resolve only hardened. They had started a war of attrition, but they had underestimated my reserves of pure, unadulterated stubbornness. The tipping point didn't come from a lawyer or a city ordinance. It came from a phone call. It was Hank, the old-timer who sold me the soggy bottom. "Hey, Leo, it's Hank," he said, his voice crackling over the line. "Just wanted to see if the city boys had hauled you off to jail yet." "Not yet, Hank," I laughed. "They're trying to bury me in paperwork instead. The latest is a fine for having an illegal fence." "A fence? That's a new one," he chuckled. "Listen, my nephew works for the local news channel. I might have mentioned your situation to him. He found it pretty darn funny. A reporter might be giving you a call." Sure enough, the next afternoon, a news van pulled up. Out stepped a young, ambitious-looking reporter named Jessica Fields, and a cameraman who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Jessica had a bright, predatory smile. She smelled a story. A weird one. "Leo Maxwell?" she asked, extending a hand. "Jessica Fields, Channel 8 News. I hear you're having a little disagreement with the city?" This was my chance. The city wanted to fight in the shadows of their bureaucratic maze. I was about to drag the whole ridiculous fight out into the sunlight. "You could say that," I said, leading them into the backyard. "Welcome to the front lines." When Jessica saw the boat, her professional smile turned into a genuine jaw-dropped grin. The cameraman let out a low whistle. "Okay," she said. "This is even better than I imagined." I gave them the grand tour. I showed them the original illegal deck. I showed them the stack of violation notices I'd received. Then I led them across the gangplank and onto the floating patio itself. I told them the whole story, from Carl's first visit to the parade of fines. The cameraman filmed it all, getting dramatic shots of the boat, the creek, and my face set in a look of charming defiance. For the on-camera interview, I sat in a lawn chair on the boat, the controversial deck visible just behind me. "So, Mr. Maxwell," Jessica began, pointing her microphone at me, "the city says you've built an illegal structure. You say this is just a misunderstanding." "Look," I said, leaning into the camera with my most earnest, everyman expression. "I'm a simple guy. I just wanted a place to grill a steak without setting the lawn on fire. The city came in and said my deck was an unpermitted structure. They fined me thousands of dollars. I tried to do it the right way. I appealed, but they wouldn't listen. So I read their own rule book, and I found a solution." I gestured around me. "The city says my deck is a structure, but the state says this," I patted the side of the boat, "is a vehicle. They want me to move my vehicle? Fine. Where do I park it? In the living room? All I'm asking for is a little common sense here." The story aired on the 6 o'clock news. It was a classic David versus Goliath piece, with me as the quirky, relatable homeowner and the city as the big, faceless bully. And then, The internet got a hold of it. The news station posted the clip on their website, and from there, it exploded. Someone posted it on Reddit under the title, "Man Fights City Hall with Malicious Compliance and a Pontoon Boat." It shot to the front page. From there, it hit Twitter, Facebook, and dozens of blogs. The hashtags #floatingpatio and #patio. Boat started trending. My phone, which usually only buzzed for work emails and texts from Sarah, began to melt. It was a constant stream of notifications. People were sharing the story, commenting, and sending me messages of support from all over the country and even the world. Memes started appearing. There was one of me photoshopped into the Washington crossing the Delaware painting, except I was on the soggy bottom. Someone else made a t-shirt design with a silhouette of the boat and the words, "Live free and float." A Justice for Leo Maxwell Facebook group popped up and gained 10,000 members overnight. I was in shock. "This is insane," I said to Sarah, scrolling through an endless feed of comments. "I'm a meme." "You're a folk hero, sweetie," she said, patting my arm. "A slightly crazy folk hero with a boat in his yard, but a hero nonetheless." A guy in Australia sent me a picture of a barbecue he was having on a surfboard. A woman in Germany commented that I was a Bürokratie rebel, which she said meant bureaucracy rebel. I had accidentally become the patron saint of everyone who's ever had to deal with a soulless paper pusher, every person who's ever been stuck on hold, every homeowner who's ever been told their fence was 2 inches too high. The tide of public opinion was a tsunami, and it was crashing directly into City Hall. The city council members, who were used to operating in quiet, unbothered obscurity, were suddenly getting angry phone calls and emails from their constituents. The mayor's office was reportedly flooded with messages demanding they leave me alone. Carl Thompson, I heard through the grapevine, had become a local pariah, the face of governmental overreach. The city was in full-blown damage control mode. They had picked a fight with a quiet IT guy, and in doing so, had inadvertently started a public relations war they were spectacularly losing. They had 2 choices: double down and look like even bigger tyrants, or find a way to back down. A week after the story went viral, a certified letter arrived. I opened it with a sense of dread, expecting some new, creatively vicious legal threat. But it wasn't another fine. It was a summons. I was being formally requested to appear before the full city council in a special open session to resolve the matter of the Maxwell property. The final showdown was set. They were bringing out the big guns. And so was I. The week leading up to the city council meeting transformed my quiet suburban home into a war room. My dining room table, normally reserved for takeout containers and unopened mail, was now covered in documents. I was preparing for this meeting like a lawyer preparing for a Supreme Court case. I had my own binder now, a thick 3-ring behemoth that dwarfed the one Carl had carried. It was my holy text of malicious compliance. Inside were printed copies of every city ordinance I could find, related to zoning, construction, and property. I had the state boating regulations, highlighted and tabbed. I had a copy of my boat's official registration, the deed to my house, and printouts of every violation notice I had received, each one in a clear plastic sleeve. My secret weapon, however, was a PowerPoint presentation I had meticulously created, complete with before and after photos, bullet points, and even a few tastefully chosen animations. Sarah played the part of the skeptical council member, grilling me every night. "Okay, try it again," she'd say, sitting across the table with a stern look on her face. But this time, when you get to the part about the city charter, try not to refer to it as a document apparently written by chimpanzees with a dictionary. But it's so accurate, I'd argue. It's needlessly complex, and half of it seems to be about bananas. Just be less sarcastic and more charmingly defiant, she coached. Think Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, but with more boats and less optimism. Fine, I sighed. I'll refer to it as a fascinating work of historical fiction. Better? She rolled her eyes. It's a start. The night of the meeting, the city council chamber was packed. It felt less like a municipal hearing and more like a title fight. The local news was there, Jessica Fields giving her cameraman instructions. The public seating area was filled with my supporters. I saw Hank in the front row, wearing a brand new t-shirt with a picture of the Soggy Bottom on it and the words Team Soggy Bottom. Next to him were Mike and Dave, the contractors, looking hilariously out of place in the formal setting, their tattooed arms crossed over their chests. Mr. Henderson, my neighbor, was there, as were dozens of other faces I recognized from the neighborhood and the Facebook group. The council members, 7 of them in total, sat on a raised dais under the harsh fluorescent lights. They looked deeply uncomfortable. This was not their usual fare of debating sewer line budgets and recycling schedules. They were on camera, in front of a full house, and they were the villains of the story. The mayor, a man named Richards, who usually looked calm and in control, looked like he hadn't slept in a week. It was surreal. A month ago, my biggest problem was a wobbly chair at work. Now I was the main event at a public hearing, the folk hero of a ridiculous cause. I half expected someone to start selling popcorn. The mayor banged his gavel. "This special session is now in order. We are here tonight to address the unique situation at the property of Mr. Leo Maxwell." He invited Carl Thompson to the podium first to present the city's case. Carl looked nervous. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by a defensive, almost whiny tone. He ran through the initial violations, his voice cracking a little as he described my flagrant disregard for civic order. He talked about the boat as if it were a biohazard, a mockery of the statutes that protect our community's property values and aesthetic harmony. The crowd was not on his side. A few low boos and hisses rippled through the room until the mayor banged his gavel for order. Then, it was my turn. "Mr. Maxwell, would you care to address the council?" the mayor asked, his voice weary. I took a deep breath, grabbed my binder, and walked to the podium. I looked out at the council, at the cameras, and at the friendly faces in the crowd. I clicked the button for my PowerPoint, and the first slide appeared on the big screen behind the council. A beautiful, sunny picture of my simple, original deck. "Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council," I began, my voice steady. "My name is Leo Maxwell, and this," I said, gesturing to the screen, "is where it all began. This is Exhibit A, a 120-square-foot rectangle of wood. My crime, according to the city, was building this without asking for permission." I walked them through the whole story. I was funny, I was self-deprecating, but I was also firm. I showed them pictures of the violation notice with the $2,500. Fine. I described the Kafkaesque nightmare of the appeals process. Then I clicked to the next slide, a dramatic, wide-angle shot of the Soggy Bottom moored in my backyard. A wave of laughter and applause swept through the room. "The city's rulebook left me with no reasonable options," I continued, raising my voice to be heard over the noise. "So I had to find an unreasonable one. This isn't about a deck, and it's not about a boat. It's about a simple question. Do these rules serve us, or do we serve them? I was fined a ridiculous amount of money not because my deck was dangerous, it wasn't, but because it didn't fit neatly into a box on a form. So I found a different box. I looked directly at the council members, making eye contact with each one. It's a boat-shaped box, but it's the one the rules allowed me. My floating patio, as absurd as it looks, is in compliance with every state and local law I could find. I am a registered boater, I am a homeowner, and I am a citizen of this city who was pushed into a corner. If the council finds my solution absurd, I agree with you 100%. It is absurd. But I would ask you to first look at the absurd problem that created it. I finished my speech, and the room erupted in applause. The council members were in a bind, and they knew it. Enforcing the fines now, after all this, would make them look like petty tyrants on the evening news. But simply backing down would make them look weak and set a precedent. They huddled together, whispering furiously. The mayor kept rubbing his temples. After a few tense minutes, Mayor Richards leaned into his microphone. "Mr. Maxwell," he said, his voice strained, "you have made your point, loudly and clearly." He cleared his throat. "The council is prepared to offer a compromise. The city will agree to drop all fines and violations related to both the original deck and the watercraft." A cheer went up from the crowd. "In return," he continued, holding up a hand for silence, "we would ask that you agree to work with our planning department and Mr. Thompson to help us draft a new, simplified, common-sense permit process for small-scale homeowner projects like decks, patios, and sheds." It was more than I could have hoped for. "And one more thing," the mayor added, a faint, tired smile on his face. "We will grant you a special, one-time, retroactive permit for your original deck. No charge." The room exploded. I had won. I had not only saved myself, but I had actually forced them to change the stupid rules. "Mr. Mayor," I said into the microphone, a huge grin on my face, "I accept your generous offer." As I walked back to my seat, the crowd was on its feet. People were patting me on the back. Hank gave me a bear hug that nearly cracked a rib. As I was leaving the chamber, I passed Carl Thompson. He was standing alone, his binder held limply at his side, looking utterly defeated. On a whim, I stuck out my hand. He looked at it for a second, then gave it a brief, limp shake. There was no victory in crushing him. The victory was in fixing the problem. I had fought the law, and for once, the law had blinked. A few months later, life had settled into a new kind of normal. The autumn leaves were turning, and a crispness was in the air. I was standing on my deck, my beautiful, legal, fully permitted deck, flipping burgers on the grill. The smell of charcoal and sizzling beef filled the air. It was the simple, suburban dream I'd had all along, just with a much, much weirder backstory. My brief, strange celebrity faded, as all internet fame does. I was no longer a trending topic, but I had become something of a local legend. Occasionally, someone would recognize me at the grocery store. "Hey, you're the patio boat guy," they'd say, and I'd give them a nod and a smile. My 15 minutes of fame had been strange, but undeniably satisfying. True to their word, the city dropped every fine. My hallway gallery of violation notices was now just a quirky art installation, and I had to make good on my end of the bargain. I spent 2 Tuesday afternoons in a conference room at City Hall with a very chastened Carl Thompson and 2 other planners hashing out what would eventually be known, informally at least, as the Leo Maxwell Small Project Act. It was a simplified, one-page permit application for any backyard project under 200 square feet. The meetings were the most painfully awkward 2 hours of my life, but we got it done. Carl and I never became friends, but we did develop a kind of grudging respect. We were two men who had met on the battlefield of bureaucracy and walked away with a treaty. And what of the soggy bottom? It was still there, floating serenely in the creek. I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. It had become a monument to the whole affair. We'd cleaned it up, and Sarah had insisted on putting some cheerful solar-powered string lights along its railings, which made it look surprisingly festive at night. It was a local landmark now. Sometimes, on weekends, cars would slow down on the street behind our house, and I'd see people pointing, their kids' faces pressed against the glass, trying to get a glimpse of the famous patio boat. One evening, Hank stopped by unannounced. He had a 6-pack of beer under his arm and that familiar twinkle in his eye. "Thought I'd come by and pay my respects to the flagship of the rebellion," he said, handing me a beer. We sat on the wooden deck, the real deck, and looked out at the boat. The string lights were just starting to glow in the twilight. "You know," Hank said, taking a long drink, "I sell a lot of old boats to a lot of people with a lot of strange ideas. But I never thought you'd actually pull it off. You're a legend, son. A legend with a very ugly boat in his yard." "It's not ugly, Hank," I said with a grin. "It's historic. It's a piece of civic history." He let out that big, booming laugh of his. "Whatever you say, Leo. Whatever you say." Later that night, after Hank had gone, Sarah came and joined me. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fireflies start to dance over the creek. The air was quiet, peaceful. The war was over. "You know," she said softly, "I was sure this was all going to end with you in jail, or us having to declare bankruptcy." "I told you I had a plan," I said. "Your plan was to buy a derelict boat and hope for the best," she countered, laughing. It wasn't so much a plan as a cry for help. "Well, it worked, didn't it?" she squeezed. My arm. "Yeah, it did." So what did I learn from all of this? I learned that sometimes the most logical solution to a problem is the most absurd one. I learned that you should always read the fine print, because somewhere in the dense, boring text, there might just be a loophole big enough to float a boat through. And I learned that if you push a reasonable, law-abiding person far enough, with enough nonsensical rules and petty fines, they will drive an hour into the countryside, buy a 20-year-old pontoon boat named the Soggy Bottom, and moor it to their back door. They fined me for a deck, and in return, I gave them a legend. And honestly, standing here now, on my legal, paid-for, and profoundly boring deck, I can say with absolute certainty that it was worth every single penny. I raised my beer bottle in a silent toast, not to my deck, but to the quirky, dented, beautiful boat still floating in the darkness. My monument to the glorious, triumphant stupidity of fighting City Hall, and, against all odds, actually winning.